Okay, well, by way of introduction to those people who don't know Jeremy, he's the owner of ImageScience, which is a business in North Melbourne that sells printers, paper, ink, and also does high-end printing for customers. There's a number of people in our club who are familiar with Jeremy's business already. And Jeremy willingly accepted the invitation to run tonight's session for us on how to choose a paper for our prints. And for people who've been around our club for a while, you would also recognise that ImageScience is a sponsor of our national, and entries close for the national in about 3 weeks' time. So it's probably timely for people who haven't done their printing already. So Jeremy, it's over to you.
Okay, thanks for that. No worries. Look, in typical form, I can't promise you that I'm not going to ramble. The subject of paper is pretty near and dear to my heart, and once I get going, I can be hard to stop. I am painfully aware also that I am terrible on timing for talks. So when I inevitably overrun, please do let me know. I should say another thing I really like to do when giving talks, and I've turned off my video so I can't see myself because that will just make me horrified. I always like to multi-purpose my content. You know, if I can get sort of you know, 2 for 1, I'll always do it. So there will be an article coming that is essentially, hopefully, a much more structured version of what I'm about to present to you, torture you with, whatever it ends up being. Okay. So first, I'd like to prevaricate slightly. It always seems a good way to start off a talk, and say that whilst this will be, without doubt, more opinionated than I tend to be, well, in public at least, paper is a very subjective thing. I'm aware of that, and people tend to have some surprisingly strong opinions about it. So, you know, there are no rights and wrongs when it comes to paper. There are certainly blacks and whites, but no real corrects and incorrects. You know, the choices that you make, both in terms of the photographs you take and what you print them on, well, they're what makes you the artist or the photographer that you are. You know, your choices are perfectly valid. You know, as I said, everyone has opinions, and it's probably fair to say that some opinions are a little more informed than others. My background is fine art print. I have been working in fine art print for 20 years now. So I have made and looked at a truly staggering number of prints. I look at prints very, very carefully. I've done a lot of print judging and so on, but really I have a, you know, it's an overused word, but I have a passion for print. You know, for me, that's, you know, primarily, you know, about really deeply looking at prints, what makes them work, what makes them successful, what makes them beautiful. So that is, you know, where I'm coming from with this. But to begin again, when talking about printing, we are, you know, generally talking, I guess, about 2 types of printing. We're either talking about printing just purely for the joy of it, to make the most beautiful thing that we can make, to make an object that is an artwork. And if all printing were like that, that would be great. But in reality, most printing actually has some sort of purpose. So we're often printing for a specific destination. That might be, you know, the wall of the gallery, if we're lucky and we're having an exhibition. It might be for an awards night at your local camera club, at the Warragul Awards, the National. It might be, you know, for the family album or some sort of fine art book purpose. You know, there is normally some sort of specific destination. So when talking about choosing a paper, we have to address those practical realities as well as those aesthetic concerns. You know, unfortunately, we must bring pragmatism into the discussion. But before I get into all of that in more detail, I would like to begin, really now for a 3rd time, at the beginning, and really talk about the history of paper with respect to photography. You know, I can guess by observing the audience that most of you are probably a little more experienced than some of the people I would talk to about this, you know, more normally, which is great. But it's worth just going over how photography fits into the greater artistic landscape. You know, some of you might shoot Nikon Z6s and so on, and be completely familiar with running a fine art inkjet printer, whereas others might, you know, shoot on an iPhone and take their prints down to Harvey Norman and accept whatever rubbish they get back. You know, so there's lots of different levels with print, so let me just start by again by addressing the history of paper. And that's really because, you know, photography stands separate from the rest of the visual arts in that for every other visual artist, their medium, and that's usually paper, is a concern and something to think about as an initial part of the process. It's right up front. You know, you can't make a drawing without grabbing a piece of paper. With photography, you can do an awful lot of it without any paper at all. And of course, more and more, you know, people are doing things without paper. They're not printing, which is a great shame. You know, for me, the art of photography will always be selectively choosing some amazing part of the world, presenting it in the best way I can, and then getting that out and making a physical object, you know, a piece of paper, usually a piece of paper, with a beautiful print on it, you know, to make a thing. That's, to me, that is the craft from front to back, and anything less is sort of half-assing it. But, you know, that's my opinion. I fully understand that for some people, print just doesn't hold that much interest anymore, and they much prefer looking at photographs on their, you know, TV screens at home or their digital projector at the camera club. You know, for photographers though, most people's introduction to printing is a pretty depressing experience. You know, they tend to start off by, well, if you're my age, you started off by taking your roll of Kodak down probably to your local chemist or newsagent. You sent it off, and, you know, about a week later, you got back a pretty miserable experience. Grain, oversaturation, you know, not all of those problems were the chemist's fault. Very often they're the photographer's fault, but a lot of them came from pretty terrible printing. You got these tacky, plasticky bits back, and it, you know, the only choice you really made about photographic printing was matte or glossy, you know, and it wasn't even matte in the true sense of the word. It was really semi-gloss, you know, and that was really, you got what you got. For the younger folk these days, you know, it's Officeworks, Harvey Norman, that sort of thing, or possibly, you know, a low quality inkjet tends to be where they start their printing journey. So it's often, you know, not much thought is given to paper, and the whole experience is you know, fairly depressing. Now, of course, that is underselling the analog era of photography somewhat, because, of course, there was, and there still is, other types of printing. I think that almost all of us have very fond memories of the joy the darkroom can give, and probably some quite significant memories of the frustration the darkroom can give as well. You know, the darkroom was this magical, mysterious location where prints would emerge. You know, the latent image would come out of the chemical baths in the eerie red light, and it was like a little bit of magic, you know, and that was great, but it was also really bloody hard to be good at it. You know, control, consistency, and repeatability were fundamental problems with the process. Sorry, I've just realized my email's open. I'm just going to shut that off. It's beeping at me. You know, it was difficult. It was hard. There was great joy in it, but for many people, there was real, you know, fear of those depths, thalassophobia, I'm pretty sure that's called. And even in the darkroom, there were relatively limited paper choices. You know, you basically had fiber-based resin coated. You had kind of quite glossy, not so glossy. You didn't really have a lot of different mediums to work with. So, you know, while you could definitely make beautiful prints, and you still can that way, it was hard, and paper wasn't a huge part of it. It was some part of it, but not a huge part. Enter digital. Around 2000, as we, you know, around the birth of the millennium, the new millennium, as we all here know, there was a massive revolution in photography. And really, it was a two-part revolution. The first part gets all the kind of interest and press, and we've all become a little bit obsessed with digital sensors. And digital sensors brought, for the first time, Moore's law, you know, the pace of computing, the doubling of power every year to photography. And it was, without question, a watershed moment in photography. You know, initially, and I remember it well, there was a lot of reluctance about digital capture. And really, now looking back on it, it seems kind of quaint, because what exactly were people holding on to? It's not like 35 millimeter film was all that. You know, the quality by modern standards was actually pretty bad. You know, it really was about 2006 when the 6 megapixel digital cameras came along, the first sort of decent digital SLRs, where it was quite easy to prove that digital had easily surpassed film, you know, in resolution terms, in dynamic range terms, in color accuracy terms, really in every practical sense. Digital very quickly put a bullet in film, which isn't to say that film doesn't have its place and there's a romance to it and all that, yada, yada, yada. But, you know, it would only really be a true follower of Ludd that does not agree with the statement that digital quality has vastly surpassed film. Just to carry on that topic for one moment, one thing is also the massively increased sensitivity. So it's not only the dynamic range, the ability to finally capture more of the world's true contrast that we got with digital sensors, but it was their tremendous low light sensitivity, which also put a bullet, for the most part, and for most photography, in flash, which possibly is the greatest thing about all of digital photography, if you ask me. You know, flash unquestionably has its place in you know, created light situations in the studio, but is otherwise pretty much an awful thing that, you know, for 99 out of 100 photographs makes it worse, not better. So the fact that we now shoot just about everything under natural light is, for me, just a tremendous pleasure. The other big revolution, though, that happened at the same time and hasn't really, I suppose, received quite as much attention, but it was digital printing. It was, in fact, the inkjet printer, this tiny assembly system, this miracle of placement, this thing that can take these minute particles of pigment and very precisely and carefully lay them onto paper. And, you know, we're just at the beginning of the inkjet revolution, much in the same way as we're really at the beginning of the digital photography revolution. You know, inkjet printing, just to put it in context, is also the basis for 3D printing. That is, again, tiny placement of particles to build something. It's simply a layered approach. Inkjet printing is now being used to do things like tissue engineering and to print bone and truly remarkable things like that. I get, you know, a surprising number of chefs ringing me who use their inkjet printer or a modified inkjet printer to print, you know, shapes out of icing or similar things. You know, the development of that tiny placement system is the other big watershed, and it's not just affecting photographic printing, of course, it's affecting all of printing. So it's worth talking a little bit about the history of inkjet printing, because obviously that leads into paper more specifically. In the early days of inkjet printing, we had, well, the most famous practitioner of early inkjet printing is of course Nash of Nash Editions. So that's Graham, I'm pretty sure, Graham Nash, the musician, who took, very bravely, took a machine that was about 125,000 US dollars, the Iris inkjet printer, and literally cut into its head to adapt it for fine art printing. And they began experimenting with printing inks onto uncoated traditional art papers. And that was the beginning of what we now know as fine art inkjet printing, that the Americans occasionally still call giclée, although that term is finally, thankfully, dying. But that was the beginning. And just around that time, or the first few years, that was in the early 90s that happened. Towards the late 90s, again, basically around 2000, Hahnemühle came along with the invention, and they really did invent this. They invented digital fine art papers. That is to say, traditional art materials coated with an ink receptive coating designed to be put through inkjet printers. And this was a revolution. Why was it a revolution? Well, we'll get into that. But the point of it, you know, well, for me in particular, I can still remember when the first Hahnemühle sample packs arrived in Australia. I got some of the first of them, and it was like a light bulb going off in my head, like fireworks. It was finally the promise of being able to take photography and all its, you know, glory of image capture and representation of the real world, and to merge that with the beauty of art printing, which, to my mind, you know, there is a centuries-long tradition of printed works on paper, and photography never really had easy access to that. I mean, It's not entirely true. You could, there were Van Dyke Browns and albumin printing, salt printing, cyanotypes, all sorts of printing mechanisms for taking photographs and putting them on fine art papers, but they were laborious and they were often very limited, and they were usually monochrome only, and often the chemicals were carcinogenic or unpleasant. So there wasn't really a good way of doing it. But when we started to get, fine art inkjet machines and pigment inks, suddenly everything changed, and it truly is a revolution for photography. So I'm just going to do a quick spot check. Can everyone still hear me okay? Because I can't see myself. Yep, thumbs up, all good. You're all muted. Great. Okay. The first, some of you may remember the Epson 2000, I'm pretty sure it was called, the first relatively affordable pigment inkjet printer. It wasn't awesome. It had some problems, no doubt about it, although it certainly looked promising. It was really, I think, a couple of years later, around 2001, 2002, when Epson released the Epson 2100, also known as the Epson 2200 in other markets, that the first really fantastic inkjet printer came along that could easily and affordably take advantage of these new art papers developed by Hahnemuhle. So this was, to use a terrible American word, a synergy. This was two things getting together and becoming fantastic, awesome, if you will. So these art papers had arrived for photography for the first time. There was an easy, accessible print process for printing onto these materials. The first papers, because they came from Hahnemuhle, were all in the European tradition, thick, heavyweight cotton papers. The amazing thing about art papers, that's immediately obvious, is that there is no optical flare at all. There is no reflectivity in the gloss sense. So you have the quietest, most sort of natural representation of the image on these papers. And again, they are beloved by artists in other visual mediums and have been for literally centuries. In fact, you could pretty much argue millennia at this point. Just as a digression, if you have an interest in paper, there is a fabulous book. I think it's just called Paper. I'll put a link in the article, but the author is Mark Kalansky, who has written many interesting non-fiction books, including a very famous one on cod, the fish. And he has an excellent one on paper that is, if you're at all interested in paper, is absolutely worth the time. So these early art papers arrived, and their pigment inks were placed upon them, and people started printing that way. And many of us who had for years looked rather jealously at the rest of the art world printing on those papers, went, wow, this is great, this is amazing, we can print on these things. It is also, though, fair to say that not all photographers were as excited by these papers. A lot of that, I think, came from simply ignorance. They never really experienced those things, and they didn't really understand the advantages that those papers had. But some of them just don't find them, and still don't find them, in fact, photographic, as they would see it. So very quickly, around 2005, 2006, we started to see what are called, or now called, darkroom alternative papers, or imitation darkroom papers, or whatever you'd like to call them. Essentially, fine art, gloss and semi-gloss materials that seek to look very much like the fiber-based materials that we loved in the darkroom. I can personally still remember the night that the first silver rag stocks arrived. So Musea Silver Rag is to many people an absolutely legendary paper in the digital world. Unfortunately, it had a fairly checkered career in that its quality control was all over the place. It was fantastic when it first began. It then basically became a completely different paper for a while. It then slowly went back to what it was and remains very good to this day. But unfortunately, it is fabulously expensive and nobody wants to import it into Australia anymore, which is a bit of a shame. Because despite the fact that it was initially released in 2006, I think it holds up well against pretty much all of those sorts of papers today. It was a truly magnificent paper. And the first night it came in was literally the busiest night I've ever had in a business. We sold more of that paper in one night, I think, than any other paper in a short spell ever. No other paper launch has come close. People really, really wanted a darkroom digital paper. And what those papers brought was the joy of the darkroom, the look of the darkroom, but with all the advantages and the pleasure of the modern digital approach, that control, that repeatability, and for many people that ease. Admittedly, digital doesn't come natural to everyone, but it does, once mastered, bring with it just a whole new level of control over your printing. And now we're really in a different place. In the early days, there weren't many papers to choose from, and there were only a few good ones and so on. But now there is too much choice in digital paper. There is an endless variety of materials from which the papers are made. You've got cotton, you've got wood pulp, you've got bamboo, you've got kozo, you've got agave, hemp, sugarcane. Just about anything that produces a fiber is turned into paper. You have all the surface types pretty much that you could possibly want, from completely matte, both smooth and textured, lightly textured, very textured. You have semi-gloss materials known as pearl, luster, blah, blah, blah. And you have full gloss and high gloss materials. You have canvases, you have printable fabrics. You have just so much choice, it's ridiculous, which I guess brings me finally to the point of tonight's talk, which is, how do you choose a paper, from all those surface types, from all those materials, from all the possible weights and all the different colors that the paper, paper tones that the paper comes in. How do you actually make a choice? Well, finally, I'm going to get to that point. Although perhaps still not as directly as you might like. It's first worth talking about what makes a good paper. What is bad and what is good in a paper. And if we look only at print quality, there are some things that we can talk about there that make a paper, just technically good for printing. First and foremost of those is the potential contrast range, because really the contrast range, or where your black lies and where your white lies, that range of tones is the boundary for what you can express with the paper. So it is the most fundamental physical property of your print, how black is your black and how white is your white. Tied into that is the tone of the paper. What color is that white? In theory, we want a good bright white. But what does bright white really mean? We all know if we go into a paint store, there's a billion shades of white. But in theory, a high white point, whatever color it might be, a high white point gives us more contrast to work with. So it's a good thing. But of course, in practice, when it comes to the nitty gritty, there's more to white point, and I will certainly talk about that. We also want a paper that is sharp, that has the ability to express razor sharp details. As sensors get more and more powerful, we are routinely seeing, 20, 30, 40, 50 megapixel images. We occasionally here in the office have people who use Hasselblad with the pixel shifting and deliver us 400 megapixel single frame shots. And we have even had people who have stitched several of those together to make truly ludicrous panoramas that contain literally gigapixels of data. We want to take this amazing modern ability to capture the finest detail of the world, and we want to then express that on paper as sharp as we can, but without digital artifact. And while I'm not really going to talk about digital sharpening, it is absolutely one of the biggest pet hates of mine. Digital sharpening is a curse, it should be banned, and pretty much with modern cameras, you just don't need it. If you need to sharpen something, you've missed your focus, go back and shoot it again. What surface appearance is best? Well, that I think is much more debatable and more arbitrary. Certain things suit certain subjects, and we'll get into that. But you could argue that in a purely technical sense, a nice smooth paper is best at expressing detail and not getting in the way of the image. So perhaps that's what we're looking for. And finally, the range of expressible tones, otherwise known as the gamut, is obviously an important part of sheer print quality. That being said, gamut is typically, and really much more, a product of the inkset, more so than the paper. The reality is that the inkset determines the gamut, more so than the paper, although certainly it plays a part. Now, before I go on, I think it's probably worth making some definitions. Excuse me if you already know these things, but just so that we're all talking the same language and everybody knows what I'm going on about. Let's start with something simple. What is an inkjet paper? Well, as I said before, an inkjet paper is a paper that has been specifically coated with an ink receptive layer, ink receptive coating, to accept inkjet ink. This ink receptive coating is put on the paper to allow it to accept much more ink, allowing you to have deeper blacks and more saturated tones, and also to prevent ink bleed, so that when you place a dot, it does not bleed and you get a very sharp mark. You can, in theory, put uncoated papers through an inkjet printer, but you'll get pretty miserable results generally, unless you're really looking for low contrast and bleed in your print, which occasionally people are. But inkjet papers, so the modern digital paper is a coated material, usually just on the one side, which is one of those things beginning printers just seem to be completely mystified by. They never, get completely confused over which side is coated. There is one good coated side that accepts an appropriate amount of ink and can thus express a beautiful image. There are, broadly speaking, two types of paper construction methods. The first is fiber-based. This is where, traditional paper making, where they basically take the pulp of a plant, or usually a plant, they mash it up, and they then essentially take a metal frame, a metal lattice, and they scoop out a layer of the pulp, it dries, and you have paper, because the fibers knit together, and you get a sheet of paper at the end of it. Fiber-based papers are natural products. They're full of natural fibers, and this means that they, and they're not, mashed too far, because we want to keep the strands intact, because that is where the strength of the paper comes from. So you do tend to get more variability and more issues with fiber than you do with the other type of paper that I'll come to in a moment. You might get seeds in your mix. You might get slight bumpiness or variability to the surface of the paper. You definitely get more quality control issues. But it's a gorgeous natural product that looks and feels beautiful. The other main type of paper is resin-coated paper. Resin is really just a code word for plastic. So resin-coated papers are either part or predominantly plastic. This is very useful in some ways. And indeed, if you look at the last sort of 50 years of photographic printing, the vast bulk of it is in fact on resin-coated papers for a number of reasons. One, they are incredibly cheap to produce. It is cheaper to make plastic than it is to grow plants, pulp it into fiber. So the more plastic in a paper, it tends to be cheaper. Plastic is inherently quite strong and resistant to tearing, so the papers are naturally tough. In particular, this is useful in things like wedding and portrait. It is also very easy to make plastic just completely consistent. It's a purely artificial product, and therefore you get this lovely smoothness and consistency from resin-coated papers. And a lot of people like those characteristics, and certainly in the commercial space, they're all highly desirable characteristics. So resin-coated papers continue to have a place in the greater market, but it is fair to say in fine art printing, they are generally poorly regarded. They're just not seen as nice, and we'll talk about that some more. Matte. What does matte mean, really? Matte traditionally in photographic paper terms has actually meant semi-gloss. Well, when we talk about matte now in the modern world, we mean truly matte. These sorts of papers are often referred to as art papers or watercolor papers as well. Everybody who has ever done art in school knows what an art paper looks like. It is totally non-reflective. It is usually has quite a nice feel to it, and it's very often made from something like cotton. Again, there's no optical flare, no glare, no strong reflectivity characteristics at all. It just presents the image as printed on it. One important attribute of being matte and a result of the very bumpy surface is that matte papers have a tendency to reflect light in all directions, and this gives them a somewhat, diffuse appearance. And it means that they are, particularly under some lights, inherently low contrast. This isn't, completely true. It really is very much dependent on light, and unfortunately, people tend to tar all matte papers with the low contrast brush, and that is not really fair or accurate. It is true that a matte paper is low contrast under direct light. Sometimes I can demonstrate this. I'm not sure how well this will come across and so on. But if we have a piece of matte paper, 100mm Photograg, an absolute classic, and I hold it to the camera, not towards the direct light, it probably looks quite inky and black. As I then move it to the light and so on, you'll probably see the blacks go chalky and appear lighter in tone. And that's, that's the sort of thing that's a bit hard to do, over a webinar context, but is a bit easier to do in person. But it's a demonstration that under the right light, matte papers actually have marvelously velvety blacks that are very attractive, and in fact can often appear blacker even than high gloss materials. But under the wrong light, they can indeed appear low contrast. Another characteristic of matte papers is that they are, notoriously vulnerable to damage. And you probably saw this print being an older print. When I moved it off axis, you may well have seen various little marks appear, particularly in those blacks. Matte papers have a very soft surface. The cotton fibers are right there, and it is trivially easy to damage matte papers. So you have to be very careful with them, and they're largely intended for uses where the print will be in some way protected, or at least not handled. Okay, gloss, we all know what gloss is. It means something shiny, it means something smooth, mirror-like. The big problem with gloss is that the angle of incidence equals the angle of reflection, which means that very often when looking at a gloss thing, you're finding yourself moving your head around, trying to work out a way of looking at the print without seeing the pin reflections of the light source that the print is under. And it can be quite unpleasant. I'll talk about that some more later. The third major type is known as pearl, luster, photomatte, semi-gloss, semi-matte. It's got about 1,000 names. They're all essentially the same thing. They are a shiny surface, but it's a stippled shiny thing. It was initially invented, so gloss papers came along as a mechanism to increase contrast in printing. Then semi-gloss came along largely as a mechanism to hide fingerprints. People found that if you handled these high contrast gloss things, that they would show every little fingerprint and mark on them, because basically they're the print equivalent of a mirror. Semi-gloss came along as, historically speaking, as a means of not showing off marks and increasing the durability of prints. It also so happened that many people liked that appearance, where you got sort of some combination of the characteristics of gloss. You got that extended contrast range, but at the same time you didn't have, because the semi-gloss surface broke up some of the light source, you didn't get that pin sharp reflection that you get from gloss, and you therefore got a diffusion of the glare, and this made them a more forgiving material. And when you talk to many photographers and ask them about their favorite papers, particularly those who printed on fiber-based papers in the darkroom, most of the papers that they talk about most lovingly are what are called F-type gloss, and that really was a semi-gloss. It was, in fact, a relatively low-gloss version of semi-gloss that gave you that inky deep black that you get from gloss papers, but had in many ways the characteristics of matte papers in that they were more forgiving. You didn't have optical flare problems, and so on. So that classic F-type print interference is still for many the holy grail, and it certainly can be one of the very attractive types of photographic printing. Optical brightening agents. I'll talk about those a little bit in more detail later. But essentially, they are chemicals put into paper as a cheap and cheerful way, let's say, of increasing the perceived brightness of a paper. Okay, so that's the definitions. Let's get back to talking about how you choose. And at the beginning, I mentioned that you have to consider the physical and planned destination, so to speak, for the final print when choosing a paper. And this is how I do it when customers come into the store and say, I just don't know what paper to print on. I talk to them and I say to them, well, what are you going to do with the print? Where is it going to end up? Because those physical things tend to trump the aesthetic concerns, because we just have to acknowledge reality. There's no point, printing on tissue paper if that print is then going to be, passed around at a party. It will, get shredded by handling in no time at all. So we have to think about the physical things. So the questions I normally ask are, is the print going to be handled? And if so, how often and by whom? Is the print going to be mounted? If it's going to be mounted, is it also going to be framed? If it's going to be framed, how will it be framed? Do you know anything about the lighting the print is going to be viewed under? And is that lighting, essentially permanent? Is it a print going into some sort of installation? Or is it likely to change significantly? And therefore you have to cope, the print has to cope with many types of light. So they're all useful questions. Let's start with, I guess, handling. If a print is going to be handled, then I immediately think semi-gloss, because it tends to hide all those marks. You can tell, and believe me, I have many, many thousands of times, I have asked people not to handle prints, not to handle sample prints, not to put their fingers on them and so on. You can print it in big bold letters right at the top of the page. Humans stick their fingers everywhere. It's just something they do. You cannot stop it. So if a print is going to be handled and you can't control that handling, you can't force people to wear gloves, then the logical choice is a semi-gloss paper. It may also lead you to think of a resin-coated paper, because those papers are strong and resistant to damage. And the resin-coated semi-gloss paper is the bread and butter of workman photography. So the wedding and portrait market, for example, is just almost purely resin-coated semi-gloss papers, because they're practical. And the other thing is, people have now been looking at those papers for 50 or 60 years. With photographs on them. So to most people, that is the thing they think of when they think, oh, a classic photo paper. What they're really thinking of is a piece of plastic with a semi-gloss surface on it. It's perhaps unfortunate, but it is what it is. So that's my, if it's going to be handled, I take a defensive approach. If the print is going to be mounted, it's pretty similar, because mounting doesn't really bring much protection to a photograph. Mounted things tend to get touched. That means, if it's going to be in any sort of high traffic area, again, you want to think semi-gloss. If it's going to be in really high traffic, you may even need to think about laminating the print and so forth as a proper protection. And many years ago, I saw a demonstration of an extremely thin lamination film that was, 0.05 microns or something ridiculous. It was just this crazy thin and perfectly matte lamination film. This was around the same time that these fine art papers was still appearing, and I have been hoping and praying for that material to appear as a sort of archival, realistic option for printing, and it never has. I've actually literally never really seen it again. Now, there are lots of laminates, including matte laminates and so on, but this was just a perfect laminate. You just could not tell it was there. It was lovely, and I don't know why it never eventuated. It was before I was doing all this professionally. I didn't, have the good sense to write down the name of the company, and I've never seen it again. It's a tremendous shame. Okay. Usually mounted prints, though, are framed, and that brings, of course, glass and Perspex into the equation, which is unfortunate. I don't think really anyone loves glass in front of prints, but there is, there is nothing better really to protect prints across the long term. And effectively, glass and Perspex are, for intents and purposes, for printing purposes, basically the same thing. There are some minor differences, but beyond the scope of tonight. The big problem with glass is that it brings a layer of reflectivity to your final piece. And particularly if you're using gloss and semi-gloss materials, you end up with a double whammy of flare issues and reflectivity issues. It is really, with a lot of prints, particularly if you have something like a metallic paper behind glass, which for many years was what you saw in a lot of Australian galleries, and to this day still see, particularly in landscape galleries, you see these very highly reflective papers mounted behind glass. And it is basically impossible to have a nice, good look at the print where, in a way where you can't see these constant reflections in the print. It is one of my real pet hates, to be honest. And it is compounded by the fact that particularly again in this country, unfortunately, there is a real tendency to light galleries in a really poorly thought out way. In fact, there was, I don't know if they still exist, but there was a company called the Gallery System that used to show up at every photo show and sold their system to galleries, you know, high and low, all over the country. And that was essentially a system of lighting where you had two little pin light sources, and you would put them on the picture rail that the print was, the framed image was hanging from, and these little stalks would project out, and there would be little halogen lights projecting these pin light sources back on to the photographs. There is literally no worse way to light a photograph than that. I mean, it is the least forgiving method of lighting. It essentially never looks good. It's always at the wrong angle because the picture rail tends to be, you know, at just the right angle, so that when you're looking at the print, you know, you're seeing those reflections constantly. It's again, it's a pet hate of mine, and you see it everywhere. I guess the question that brings is, how should it be done? How should you light a gallery? Well, the European approach is far better. It's essentially where you create a massive diffuse light source. Generally speaking, that is done by projecting lights off the ceiling of the gallery. That acts as a massive white reflector, and you essentially get perfectly soft but bright light lighting up your prints. And this allows you to see really just not just prints, but any artwork in the most attractive lighting. And it's something that it obviously takes, you know, more cost and expense to set up, but you very rarely see that in galleries in this country, which is a real shame. And you know, whenever people come to me to talk about how to set up their galleries and so on, it's absolutely one of the things I don't shut up about, because galleries should have even, soft and completely diffuse lighting, not point light sources. Now, that isn't to say there's never a place for the pool of light thing, and particularly in the home environment where you can control very well the angles of those lights. You can get them up really high so that you don't have to look at those reflections when you're looking at your work. You can absolutely light prints in a pool of light and have it be a very attractive thing. But in general, it's a bad way of lighting prints. And it is also an argument against the use of gloss and semi-gloss materials, but particularly gloss materials, in the context of framing behind glass. When you frame behind glass, matte materials tend to be the most attractive. They tend to lose some of that characteristic of the lower contrast. The glass lends them a little bit of gloss, you could say. So you lose that disadvantage, but you have all the other advantages of the quiet expression of the images behind the glass. You know, you can't get rid of the reflectivity on the glass. You can use museum glass, and to a certain extent that works, although it has a little bit of an unfortunate green tint. But those matte materials tend to look very complementary. You know, they have that increased gloss, and they sit quietly behind the glass. And you know, you can really take advantage of those properties and present them in a beautiful way. For example, you can do things like box framing, where the paper is sat some distance behind the glass. There's often, you know, 5 or 10 centimeters in between the glass and the paper. And this really allows your eye to look through the glass and to experience the print as an object, you know, as a thing independent of the glass. Another approach that I have seen and can actually be really effective is actually where you use a box frame again, but the glass is actually put right next to the print, usually just a millimeter or two in front of it. But non-reflective glass is used, and if that is lit at all sympathetically, then from a distance, you know, or even from a couple of feet away, you simply can't even tell the glass is there. And again, you can really see the paper as a thing in that way, and it is beautiful. I'm going off on a tangent here. Okay. Okay. Next, we might look at the archival requirements when choosing a paper. You know, it's a fair question to ask. Do you really need archival? I mean, the vast bulk of things that are printed archivally, it's probably pure vanity. You don't really need those prints to last centuries. You know, and sort of as a byproduct of this quest for archival printing has been the death of high quality dye-based inkjet printers, which is a real shame because dye inks are much easier to get out of an inkjet head. There's much less problems with clogging. There are less problems with consistency, and the inks are much cheaper to manufacture. The print quality can be utterly superb. And, you know, for many purposes, a really high quality dye-based machine would be the perfect tool. But everybody seems to have given up on developing those. Epson don't do it anymore. Canon don't do it anymore. HP don't do it anymore. All the photographic inkjet printers made today, you know, the multi-ink ones and the ones with the special black and white modes and so on, they are all, without exception, pigment inks. And that means that printing, you know, modern photographic printing is essentially archival by default at this point. So even if you don't really need archival, you're getting it anyway. You know, and, you know, when I say archival, we're talking about really archival prints at this point. You know, if you compare it to what was the benchmark for photographic archival printing, something like Cibachrome, also known as Ilfochrome, from the darkroom days, you know, color prints made with those technologies, those methods, had a lifespan of about 25 to 50 years before visible shift occurred. Whereas inkjet prints, pigment ink, are a minimum of about a century at this point. And in many cases, with many paper combinations and with particularly with black and white inkjet prints, the lifespan is centuries. You know, the only other color process or image process that comes anywhere close to the archival longevity of modern fine art inkjet printing is oil painting. That's really it. You know, and smearing ochre pigments on capes. You know, those are the and really in many ways it's almost the same thing. You know, it's a pigment on an archival substrate, you know, it is highly archival. So whether you need it or not, if you're printing for yourself or you're printing at a fine art printing surface like ours, you're getting archival. You know, whether you like it or not. You know, it's probably worth mentioning that definition of archival is a little bit smoke and mirrory in the sense of, you know, you can hide a lot of things in the term visible shift. But to be fair, you know, visible shift is you know, prints made these way and even Cibachromes and so on, they don't disappear in a puff of smoke. It really is talking about when an observable change happens. That change is almost always in the yellow side of the print. The print or the paper will begin to yellow and the yellow ink will begin to fade. So it's always yellows. In the one hand, it's increased yellow from the paper. It's decreased yellow from the yellow ink, which is always the least stable ink. It's usually defined as a 5 or 10% shift in the appearance of yellow in the print. So it's not necessarily a dramatic change. So, you know, there is some leeway. A print is not literally identical from the day it is made to 100 years later. But I can tell you, even I personally have inkjet prints from the early 2000s, so 2001, which I could print today and they would be imperceptible. They would be identical to prints made today. So that's not accelerated testing, that's real world testing of more than 20 years. There is no question that Cibachromes would be beginning to show their age in that same time span. And Cibachromes were spectacularly difficult and expensive to make. And the chemicals were distinctly carcinogenic. So, you know, we've definitely moved forward. Next, I should talk about optical brightening agents again in a little bit more detail. So an optical brightening agent is a chemical, a fluorescent chemical that is put into paper to convert light outside of the visible spectrum into blue light. So it makes the whites of a paper appear more blue. And this increase in the amount of blue reflectance in the paper makes the paper appear brighter. It's a thing about the human eye that bluer appears brighter than warmer. Even if technically speaking, if you measure the amount of light coming off the paper, it might be equal in a warm tone paper and a blue tone paper. The reality is your psychosomatic perception, shall we say, of that paper will be that the blue paper is brighter. OBAs are used everywhere. You know, they're in detergent, they're in toothpaste. You know, well, I'm guessing not a lot of you go to nightclubs with black lights anymore, but if you were to, you know, you'll see the disturbing thing that happens when people's teeth glow from the optical brightness that's in their toothpaste. And if you see a person whose teeth aren't glowing, well, you know, they don't have good dental hygiene. You know, the history of photographic printing is meshed with OBAs. You know, I suspect OBAs were in part developed for such things, and I don't know that, but they have been used by photographers for as long as they have existed. And if you ever want to see proof of this, you can take yourself along to the National Gallery and ask to see their photographic print collection. It's not generally on open show, but you can go and see it by request. And they have original prints there from Ansel Adams, Weston, you know, Sexton, great photographic printers of the days of yore. And those prints, often now, you know, many decades old, have an ivory tone to them. And that ivory tone has specifically come from the faded optical brightening agents. They were put in papers that weren't particularly bright to start with. They used a lot of OBAs, and the net result ended up being this distinct ivory tone that is now seen as an attractive characteristic of historical photographic printing. So in some ways that may not even be a problem at all, but it is fair to say that it is in vogue now to very much avoid optical brightness in digital printing. And the problem with them is the change. You know, the papers initially appear brighter, but they have a much more accelerated change curve. So that visible difference is going to occur much more quickly with a paper that has an OBA in it than with a paper that never had it in, and so on. So, you know, it's something to be wary of, and there is no doubt it's fashionable to avoid them, but it's also important to understand that in reality, the OBA use in most digital papers is actually very minor. It's put in usually not to the coating, but it's put into the fiber mix, the base mix that makes the substrate. And it is done essentially to even out the grades of materials that come into the factory. You know, Hahnemüller brings in cotton from a variety of places, and you get slightly whiter cotton from one region than from another. And they even that out using a chemical process. Because it is in the substrate and not in the coating, has probably next to no effect on the archival longevity of the print. So it's not truly evil, and I wouldn't worry about it too much. I think it is one of those things that people tend to worry about too much. And the price you pay for the lack of optical brightness is significantly less contrast. Your white is not as bright, and therefore your contrast range, which could be here, is down here. And that may be a significant problem. If you are printing simply to create the best print that you can, for example, you're printing to enter an award, then you don't care, you know, that in 50 years that print may not be as beautiful as the day that you made it. It's not really relevant. The trophy's already on your shelf at home, hopefully. So you just want it to look as good as possible. So in that context, having that extra contrast range may well be a very desirable characteristic, and concern about OBA should be thrown out the window. You know, you need to think about what you're using the print for. Just to get back to resin-coated and fiber-based, I think I've covered that in some detail, but it's worth looking at it from an archival perspective as well. Resin-coated is essentially less archival. Because it's plastic, or at least somewhat plastic, it suffers from things like cracking problems and so forth over time. It tends to become brittle and degrade more so than paper fiber does. And particularly if you have placed your resin-coated print and adhered it to a board, then when the board over time shifts, because plastic is more rigid than fiber, it tends to exacerbate problems with cracking and so on again. So in general, archival printing and resin-coated papers don't really go together. Fiber-based, it's better in all ways, really, other than that sort of toughness and cheapness that you get from, and smoothness that you get from resin-coated. You can put a higher ink load on it. It's fundamentally more beautiful. I think that's almost impossible to argue against. It feels better. Your print as an object, not just as an image, but as a thing, as a tangible physical thing in the real world. You know, it brings a sense of quality and attractiveness to prints. You know, it helps enhance that print as a complete experience thing that we're all kind of looking for when we print, hopefully. One exception, though, you know, to the greatness that is fiber-based papers is high gloss. as I said before, fiber-based materials are not as smooth. So really high gloss is hard to achieve with a fiber-based material because they're just not smooth enough. In actuality, the best high gloss prints are still made with chemistry printing. It's the one area where you can truly say chemistry still has a significant advantage over pigment ink on archival materials. And that is because in fact, the really high gloss prints, which are made on things like metallic, what are called metallic papers, Kodak and Dura metallic, and so forth, they're not papers at all. They are pure plastic. They are 100% polyester, and they are wicked smooth. You know, they are flat as anything. They are very much mirror-like in appearance. And the photoreceptive layer sits behind that lovely gloss layer that you're getting from the smoothness. So when the image is printed, unlike with an inkjet, where the ink sits on top of the print and thus creates more unevenness to the surface and therefore less gloss. With the chemistry papers, that photoreceptive layer is lower than the gloss and thus untarnished when printed on, and you get this amazing mirror-like appearance that can bring tremendous dimensionality to certain works. You know, for landscapes, for example, it can look pretty spectacular. It could be the right horse for the course, and you know, that's just a fact of life. Inkjet is good at just about everything. It's not great at very high gloss. That's a place that chemistry still rules. And the other big place, of course, is cost. Chemistry printing is incredibly cheap in comparison to inkjet printing. And if you're making literally, you know, hundreds or thousands of prints, there's still an argument to be made for chemistry printing. But for really, you know, high print quality, it's almost always the case that inkjet is the best mechanism. I'll just digress also into environmental considerations. You know, I don't want to bring up climate change, which is almost a religious subject at this point, but whether or not you believe in climate change, hopefully you do, but whether you don't or not, you know, it doesn't bother me, but you probably still don't want to live in a highly polluted planet. And, you know, I think it's fair to say that we've all come to the conclusion that plastic is bad. So put simply, if you don't really need plastic, don't use it. You know, fiber sources are inherently recyclable. You can basically take pulp, form it into something, then repulp it, form it into something else, and you can keep on repeating that process. Admittedly, you know, impurities get into the mix and the quality tends to degrade, but it can be used many times over. And so it's inherently reusable. That's a good thing. If you're purchasing a paper and you are interested in the environment, as hopefully you are, you should check the credentials of the people making the paper. If they are making paper the right way and they are using renewable fiber sources that are appropriately cultivated and harvested without massive environmental degradation, then they will advertise that fact. You know, certainly, for example, you don't see most clothes manufacturers advertising that because they will quite happily clear fell rainforest to plant more cotton for clothes. Fortunately, most of the paper makers have been around for centuries and have a really long distance view on these things. And a little, I guess, bit of trivia is that these papers, which are often called cotton rag papers, the word rag there refers to the fashion industry because these papers were originally made with cut-offs from the fashion industry. It was, you know, the ultimate example of using waste to create something beautiful. They used cotton that came from the fashion industry, they pulped it up and made paper from it. Now, obviously, now they use plantation cotton, but they are very careful about sourcing that from appropriate providers who pay some attention. Of course, cotton is still cotton. It is still going to be something that uses a lot of water and is you know, a relatively environmentally intensive fiber to produce. So consider alternative materials. We're finally seeing, you know, for a few years now, we've had excellent bamboo papers. We're now finally, just in the last year or two, seeing papers made from hemp and agave and so forth. Bamboo and hemp are two really logical fibers to use for paper because they're both massively more environmentally friendly than most other fibers. So, you know, those are things you should have a look at if those are concerning, if the environment is of concern to you. They cost more. There's no getting around that. You've got to use your green dollar if you want the world to change. You know, we won't achieve change without people being willing to spend a little bit more on those products because they give a crap about the world, and hopefully you do. If you don't, you know, I understand that maybe it's not your thing, and so on, but if you can, factor that in. And really, ultimately, it's the combination of recyclable and archival, that's a good thing. You know, archival means you're making something to last and it probably won't need to be replaced. Recyclable means if it ever does need to be replaced, it can be done so, you know, in a relatively inexpensive way, particularly from environmental terms. Okay, finally getting to what is perhaps the ultimate point, let's talk about aesthetics, because I'm already a little, or at the time limit, so I need to get on with things. Okay. Without being too repetitious, we're going to talk about surface appearance, paper tone, the two together, defining contrast range. We're going to talk about sympathy with subject, then we're going to talk about texture. Is that okay? You know, is it all right if I keep going, or? Oh, hello?
Hi, Jeremy. Yeah, I was muted. Yes, it's fine to keep going.
Fine to keep going. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I think realistically, I've probably got about another 15 minutes, if that's okay.
And if, I mean, if people need to be somewhere else, then I'm sure you'll understand if they drop
I will.
out.
Yes, of course. I
think
do tend to
people are pretty engaged, and you'll probably have a few questions at the end, I suspect.
Yep, they're welcome. No problem at all. All right. Yep, cool. I'll carry on. Okay, so talking about surface appearance from an aesthetic point of view, you know, again, it's a very subjective thing. What you like is what you like, but there are natural strengths and weaknesses to the different types of surfaces. So matte, semi in some form, and gloss. Starting with matte, it's inherently, for want of a better word, arty. It's subtle. A smooth matte paper tends to get out of the way of your image. It allows a very naturalistic representation of the image itself without the paper being in your face. You know, contrary perhaps to the intuitive or popular opinion, matte papers are the sharpest of all paper types. This is quite easily provable. If you do some print testing and take, you know, the sharpest image you can find and print it on the different materials with correct technique, you will see that digital fine art inkjet papers with a matte surface are as sharp as things get. I mean, truly astonishingly sharp. There is no bleed at all whatsoever, and gloss has, you know, in practice has a tendency to diffuse the ink just ever so slightly more. And make it appear slightly less sharp. So that's a common misconception. If you want a really sharp print, matte is the way to go. A common mistake with printing on matte papers, and it's a very natural one, is to think because the paper is inherently, to a certain extent and under a certain light, it is lower contrast. Therefore, I will choose images that go with that. They run with the low contrast thing. They choose, you know, shots of boats in fog or you know, smoky whatever, you know, they inherently think, oh, I'll put my low contrast image onto this low contrast paper. But low contrast times low contrast is low contrast squared. It means you end up, or you tend to end up with mush. It is a classic mistake, and an important part of the learning process of learning to deal with matte materials is image selection to suit it, which means, generally speaking, you probably should actually err to images that inherently have a higher contrast within them. But also in your preparation of those images for printing on those materials, there's no doubt that matte is the hardest to prepare for because of that somewhat narrow range of contrast. Therefore, you need to be a little bit more careful. And one of the things you most likely should do is increase the contrast slightly beyond where you perhaps think you should, so that you are being sure that you are taking full advantage of what contrast is available to you. Okay, next, let's talk about semi-gloss. You know, it's the happy medium of papers. It's the vanilla ice cream. That being said, that's a little unfair. For many, it's the holy grail. What you want is, as I said before, that fiber gloss appearance. You want basically the quietness and naturalness of a matte paper, but the contrast and weight and glow of a gloss paper, F-type gloss it was called. And you know, in inkjet papers you see all the time the word burrito now. Burrito is, you know, it's not, first of all, it's not a miracle. There are many other chemicals or minerals, shall we call it, that are similar to burrito, which is barium sulfate. And you know, burrito is in many ways just tossed around as the group name for these chalky-like substances that are put into the coatings of paper. Burrito tends to smooth out the coating and to make it a little bit a cleaner white, a brighter white. So in general, you probably want that if you're trying to mimic that F-type appearance. And indeed, most people would argue that the F-type appearance comes from specifically Barita papers. There's a distinct smell to them even that people love. In general, they're a good thing, Barita papers. And the disadvantage of them, though, is that, like chalk in general, they're extremely soft, these chemicals. So we have seen, and particularly many of the early examples of these papers were really soft and scratchable. So you do need to be a bit careful, particularly if you're choosing a semi-gloss paper because it's more robust, but you then go and choose a Barita paper, which turns out to be super soft and very scratchable. Well, that was probably a mistake. But you know, it is aesthetically, it's that happy medium in terms of its ability to express contrast. And then at the other end, the extreme end, we have gloss papers. You know, slick, commercial, brilliant, dazzling, high impact, high contrast. It, like a mirror or perhaps this webcam, is unforgiving of flaws. The smoothness of the surface, if it's marred in any way, will very quickly become visible. You'll see marks and so on. You'll see fingerprints and whatnot. But it brings to subjects that slick and commercial appearance and that inherently high contrast thing. So works very well with those. But weirdly, it is often gloss papers that work well, or not weirdly, but going back to that point I made about matte papers, it's often gloss papers that work really well with those foggy scenes and so forth. Because the scene itself doesn't have much depth due to contrast, the fact that the paper itself is quite contrasty tends to bring out the differences in those tones in a way that promotes a sensation of depth. So something to consider there. Paper tone is one to think about. In theory, you want a bright paper tone. It gives you the maximum contrast. It increases that gap between black and white. But we know that because of OBAs, that brightness can't be relied on over time. But it's worth remembering that bright whites through OBAs don't just give you the best contrast, they give you the best saturation and gamut as well. So OBAs don't just affect the white colors, they affect all of the saturated colors, really all of the colors, full stop, but most visibly in the saturated tones. They tend to make your images really pop. So if you are looking for maximum saturation, you've got a photograph of a rainbow lorikeet or a field of tulips or something, inherently that you want to pop, then you probably want a paper with a high brightness point and probably with optical brightness on it. Though a factor here to consider is optical brightness means a tendency towards a bluish tone in the paper. That means those papers can actually be quite bad at expressing warm tones and red tones. So if you have a warm skin tone or a, I don't know, picture of a fire in the distance or something, then you can be fighting against that blue in the paper. And you don't really want to be fighting the tone of the paper because it means you get a reduction in the purity of color that you're expressing. It just tends to look less good. Warm whites are at the other end of the spectrum. They tend to bring a positivity and approachability to prints, particularly with skin tones and portraiture. They have always been popular in the portrait market. And skin tones, any skin tone, it's not a racist comment, whether you are, any shade from darkest black to whitest white. Those skin tones tend to look better when they are printed with warmth. We've all been sort of trained by the media to like tan skin tones and so forth. However, it's harder because of the warm white brings that sort of maximum brightness point down. It's harder to express contrast. So you can struggle to get the kick from a warm paper that you get from the cool papers. And being warm, it will have the opposite of those bright, cool papers. It will struggle to express cool tones. So for example, if you have, a photograph of the rolling surf or the French Alps with a azure sky over fields of ice crystals or snow, what have you, printing that on something like Hanemüller bamboo, a matte, warm paper, just isn't going to work. You're going to be trying to fight that warm tone. You're not going to get those lovely pure blues that you're looking for. So then we have the in-betweener again, a bit like semi-gloss is the in-betweener of the surfaces, natural whites is the in-betweener. Those are not brightened, they're not particularly warm, but they're not particularly cold. They tend to express everything quite well. They have a good contrast range, and consequently, something like 70% of the paper market is made to that natural white point. But hopefully there's a few tips that might help you with choosing a paper tone for a particular subject. And that is a pet subject of mine. I think that you should think about the subject that you're printing when you're choosing your paper, because there is often a natural analog to your image, to what's in your image in the paper world. For example, there is that to give you the obvious, a simple example, if you've got a shot of water, it's almost always going to look better on semi-gloss or even gloss, because water is inherently glossy. There is a natural concordance between the physical attributes of water itself and the physical attributes of that as a paper choice. So think about that when choosing your paper. If I've got a print of rocks, I'm probably again thinking, a gloss paper with its kind of hard appearance and probably a bright white point. Whereas if I've got a portrait, a classic portrait of someone, say, an Indian man shot at dawn. I've got a few of those in my portfolio, and so on. I will always print them on a warm toned paper because that, the light emerging in the dawn and the warm skin tones just radiate and make the whole print more approachable. Texture is worth talking about. It's I think an area that it's fraught with peril. Textured papers, they are one of the best things about art papers. You can have this lovely texture on paper, but they can quickly go wrong on you as well. So I would say to some people they're anathema. They will never like textured papers, and that's just how it is. But in general, use them with caution. Obviously, they can immediately make your image appear arty and traditional. But if used poorly, they're the kind of the paper equivalent of Photoshop filters. They can very quickly make a mess of things. Some general rules would be save the more heavily textured papers for bigger prints. Small prints are overwhelmed by strong textures. All you really see is the texture and not the image. So things like Hahnemuller torsion and aquarelle and so forth from Canson, very heavily textured papers, are best used in larger sheets or roll form, where that texture, is spread through a large part of your image area, and it doesn't just take everything over. Probably the best use of textured papers is with images where you have large areas of one tone or a similar group of tones. Basically, if for example, you have a silhouette, in the background of your photograph, it's a bunch of basically, rocky, black, featureless, it's a detailless area of your photograph. If it's a large part of your photograph, some might argue it's the most boring part of your photograph. Textured paper is a nice trick for filling up those less immediately interesting areas of your photograph with just a little bit of visual interest. They can really help those regions just by giving a bit of life to those detailless areas in your photographs. With texture papers, and actually, quite frankly, with printing in general, leave some white space around your image. Borderless printing reeks of amateur printing. It takes people back to those chemist prints, the 6x4s presented, hard up the edge with no border, and to what to me is just the worst type of printing. Having some paper white around your image allows the viewer to view the paper as an object, to integrate the viewing of the paper with the viewing of the image that is on that paper. It gives your image room to breathe, and particularly with textured papers, but really with all printing, some white space around your image will pretty much always make your image have a perceived feeling of quality. Okay, the last things I'm very quickly going to touch on are cost, quality, and availability, just because there's some practical concerns. First is quality. If you stick to the name brands, that's Hahnemuller, Ilford, Canson, those sorts of people, all of their papers are good. If you're using good technique and good color management, if you know what you're doing and you know how to print, and if you don't, feel free to ask me some questions. But if you're doing things right, they're all essentially equal in quality terms. It's really much more about the visual appearance that you like, the other attributes, you know, availability, blah, 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 that work for you. There are no bad papers from those makers. On the flip side, I generally say to people, you should probably largely avoid Canon and Epson. In general, their papers are highly overpriced. They have bad availability. And in general, they're just rebadging other people's papers and charging more for them anyway. So you can usually find an equivalent paper in somebody else's range for a lower price and with much better availability, because Canon and Epson don't make papers. They make inks. First and foremost, you know, well, Canon make a lot of other things, but, you know, Epson is an ink company at its heart. Inks and printer heads. In fact, most of their printers aren't even made by themselves. You know, they use, yeah, anyway, that's a long story. Custom profiles, of course, are still essential to getting great results. You can use profiles downloaded from the paper manufacturers to test papers and so on. But, you know, having made and evaluated literally hundreds of thousands of prints, I can tell you the best way to make them is to choose some favorite papers and have custom profiles made for those papers. It's inexpensive. It gives you the best quality results. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I'm happy to take questions either now or offline later on. Okay, cost. Honestly, it's pretty much irrelevant. If you know what you're doing, your hit rate with printing should be very high indeed. You should barely ever need to do test prints. You should be, you know, at that point where what you see is what you get. And you really can get very, very close to that. In which case, you know, whether your sheet of paper costs you $1.50 or $2, next to the cost of the ink, it's nothing. Next to the cost of the really important thing in your life, which is time, it's nothing as well. It's just not that important. People worry too much about a few dollars here or there. Now, you know, I say that obviously if you're poor, well, if you're poor, then photography is not really the hobby for you. Generally, it's fair to say it's an expensive hobby. But, you know, I'm being blasé about that. But the reality is the small differences in sheet cost really don't count for much at end. If you're finding that you're wasting a lot of paper, then improve your technique and we'll be happy to help with that. Finally, availability. It's worth talking about because that is important. It's very frustrating to invest a whole lot of time in getting a process right. You know, you have custom profiles made. You calibrate your monitor in such a way that it's a great predictor of the final print that you're planning to make. And then you go to buy your paper and you just can't get it. That is very frustrating. So good availability is important. You know, you probably, if you follow ImageScience as a business, you will see we have a pretty strong leaning towards Hahnemühle first and foremost, and probably secondarily towards Ilfit. There are good reasons for that. For example, Canson, while they make some lovely papers, have done a number of things over the years that I just consider to be fundamentally dishonest business practice. For example, you know, when they first started as a digital paper maker, they used stock from the Arches mill. And Canson is a coating company. They don't make paper. They coated Arches paper stock. And for years, that was great. You know, Arches are classic fine art paper makers, and there are some beautiful papers in their collection. However, Canson then lost the rights. They managed to annoy Arches, something like that. No one has ever really told me exactly what went wrong there, but for some reason, Canson were essentially struck off from the Arches mill. They were no longer allowed to produce or to buy Arches paper. And this meant in the space of a few months, all of their papers radically changed. You know, you cannot go to another paper mill and say, make me a paper that looks like Aquarel. It's simply not possible. Each paper is a very unique combination of machines and processes that results in its final appearance. It cannot be mimicked. People have tried many times, it doesn't work. Canson changed all of their papers, their entire range, and they did not tell anyone. For 12 months, we had endless phone calls saying, why does my Aquarel not look like the last box of Aquarel? It's nothing like it. You know, they didn't tell anyone. And this was very frustrating. And just recently, they threatened to do this again. And this drove me nuts. I sent a very strongly worded email about it. And fortunately, they have decided against it. And you will have perhaps seen recently that they have released a new specific new range. They haven't just changed their existing range under the same labels. They've got a new range called, Arches Canson, or Canson Arches, blah, blah. So at least this time they're bringing in the new papers and everybody knows what's going on and so on. But fundamentally, they also have some fairly regular availability problems. So Canson's a little bit low down on my list. Ilford's a bit higher again. A couple of reasons. They're now Australian owned, which is not a bad thing. It keeps, some money in the country and all that. It's fair to say, though, they have been, absolutely the success story of papers in recent years. They have gone from almost no place in the fine art market to a very significant place in the fine art market. But they're victims of their own success. They have unquestionably had some supply problems along the way. And particularly thanks to COVID, they haven't truly solved those yet, but they plan to. Finally, there's Hahnemühle. Hahnemühle, there was a brief glitch with a local importer recently, but apart from that, we have been selling and using Hahnemühle paper for 20 years. Availability is truly fantastic. They invented the stuff. They have a fabulous range. They are literally 70% of the digital fine art paper market all on their own. They are the kings of this category. So if you're going to choose one, choose probably Hahnemühle overall, because they have good choices, beautiful choices, and they have great availability. The cost is often on par, possibly a little bit higher than, say, Ilford, but it's fairly reasonable. And Hahnemühle did ask me to tell you that they would be quite happy to throw some free sample packs towards the Warragul Camera Club if you have an interest in that after the hour and 20 minutes that you've been forced to listen to me. On that note, I am at the end of my prepared material. So if anyone is still there, I am happy to have some questions or whatever you'd like to do, really.
I'm happy for people to have questions, Jeremy. I might just unmute everybody and ask people if they do have a question to actually raise their hand.
That would be good. Can you, I don't know how to get my screen back now. How do I, so I can see everyone kind of thing.
To unspotlight you.
Yes, well, why not? There we go. Oh, good. There's actually some people left. All right. Yeah, I'm sitting here, literally, I can't hear anyone, and I'm just literally talking at a black screen. So it's a weird experience. I don't like seeing myself while I'm doing it, so I turn that off because otherwise I'm looking back at myself. Anyway, questions? Anyone?
David.
Hi, David. Yes, I recognize you. How are you going?
Hi, Jeremy. One little comment about the printing on matte papers. Les Warfling actually puts a layer on to emphasize the dark end of the spectrum. So it's got an extra layer just for printing on matte, and it actually comes up with give you a much deeper end of the spectrum.
Are you talking about his profiling practices where
no, I'm not talking about. I was at one of his print workshops, and right. I said, look, I'm disappointed with the blacks I'm getting from the darker ends I'm getting from when I print on matte paper.
Right.
And he specifically went through a procedure where he actually duplicates a layer and then he puts a curve on it, so he's just emphasizing the bottom end.
Yep. So he's really he's emphasizing those sort of 3/4 and below tones. Yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely. Look, matte paper takes longer to get to know and to learn to print well on. There's just no doubt about that. The reality is the blackest black you can get is a fixed property. There's no magic that Les or I can do that can change that. It's a property of the paper that you're using and the inkset that you're using. But absolutely, what you can do is improve your image preparation for matte papers, and you have to be particularly careful with the deep shadows. And also, one thing I didn't really talk about there, but it's another pet subject of mine, is how image size affects shadow perception. So for example, when you're printing small, that means your shadows are across a very small area and it's hard for your eye to see into the shadows. On the other hand, if you take that same image and you print it very large, then the shadows open up inherently. So you need to print the shadows lower for the same effect. So people have some very sort of simplistic ideas about printing, that if they get it looking right on their little 6x4 proof and then they print it the size of a poster, they're going to be happy with it. But if you look at things with a critical eye, the small print is fundamentally quite different to the big print, and you need to factor that in to your image preparation.
Oh, it's an art.
It is an art, absolutely. Yeah, sure. It's both science and an art. The science is the tool that you use, but you really need to, understand the art and what you're trying to achieve. And to analyze prints, the first thing I do when I teach printing, when I used to go to RMIT and teach the third years there how to print. The first thing I said is, I'm not going to teach you how to print before I teach you how to look at prints, how to analyze prints, to break them down and what makes, to make them work. And it's no different from any other art form. If you're trying to learn how to write a song, you look at the construction of the song, what's going on with the bass, what's going on with the beat, etc. You have to break things down and analyze them in detail. And that is just as true with the craft of printing as it is with any other craft.
Well, tell us when you're running another course at RMIT.
Yeah, well, I haven't done one for a while now, really. I went and had kids, and that ruined everything. So,
it always does.
Yeah, I love them, but by God, they take a lot of time. So, it's for years I haven't actually been doing many of these talks, largely because I wanted to be involved and help with them, and they're like just a massive black hole for time.
Yeah.
Jeremy, you have a question from our president, Bruce.
Bruce, how are you going?
Good, Jeremy, thank you. Great talk this evening. I was just interested, you mentioned about a white, having a white border around the images.
Yeah.
We often will use a matte board
yes.
for our images. Is that
yeah, look, that's a perfectly acceptable way to do it. I personally prefer a bit more of the actual paper because, as I said, it helps your eye interpret particularly if you're using textured paper and the fine art papers which have some grain to them. It helps lead your eye into interpreting that texture within the image. So for me personally, I prefer that to a matte board, but that is absolutely another way. And the visual breathing space is identical whether it comes from a paper white or a matte board white. You can certainly do both. But my favorite type of print, and when I'm considering the print really as sort of a complete object, is a print where the paper extends well beyond the image area, and I'm allowed to see the physicality of the medium that it's on as part of that viewing experience.
Yeah.
Okay. So in other words, the matte board with the contour down to the image. So in other words,
even given a matte board, I will actually tend to cut the matte if I'm actually having something framed, for example. I will the matte board will actually be outside of a white area of the paper itself. But then you get into the murky area of matching the white matte board, or often you don't need to use a white, but it can be difficult to then match paper tone and the matte board tone. So in the end, what looks good looks good. But,
so you'd be quite happy with a matte board, even with the white inside as well. Is that a common thing that's done?
I see it a lot. It's not my preferred approach, but I do see it regularly. And I say that, but some of the finest framing examples I can think of still do use matte boards. But in general, there is a fashion, a very strong fashion, in fact, away from matte boards. They're seen as old-fashioned and fussy, and nobody does like triple matting and all that stuff anymore, really. But even a single matte board is kind of poo-pooed by many people. I
guess a lot of ours are put up for exhibitions and shows without actually sitting in a frame. So
sure. Yep.
we have them for presentation, but
absolutely, and it gives you that, there's all that physical protection stuff as well.
Yeah, exactly. Oh no, it's interesting to for actually your own prints that you're going to be putting on your wall at home.
Yeah, I mean, and to be honest, I mean, I've done lots of print assessment of the typical mounted thing under a light or whatever, but my preferred way to really evaluate and or actually judge prints is to have them as physical objects outside of the mat that I can really, I can hang on to and look at and try different angles and all that sort of thing. To me, a print it's more than just a flat plane on the wall. It's a thing. It's an object. It's an artifact.
And maybe that border would give you a space to hang on to the print as well if you're doing that.
Well, exactly. Yes, I cannot tell you how many prints have been killed simply because they were borderless, and that means that they're very vulnerable. So, white space, is just sensible on so many levels.
Yeah, thanks for that.
That's right.
Yeah.
David again.
Just one. I'd like to endorse your comments about Hahnemuller. I mainly use Ilford, because, and I like a lot of the Ilford papers, and if you want something robust to send along to, you know, national competitions,
Yep.
there's nothing better than the smooth gloss. It's robust, works.
Sure, it's definitely robust. Yep.
Yeah, but I bought a couple of boxes of the Hahnemuhle Silk Baryta a while back, and there's something about it I really love.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. Look, I mean, you know, even though I spoke for an hour and 20 minutes on it, again, paper, it's so subjective. It really, a lot of it comes down to what you like and what works well with your particular style of imagery. You know, generally as we progress as photographers, we do, you know, we don't just shoot everything. Well, some people do, obviously, but, you know, you tend to develop a style and you tend to develop an approach that works for you. And that kind of goes hand in hand with learning to find a sympathetic material and to you know, therefore take the whole thing right from capture to paper. And when you get all of those ducks in a row, that's when it really, you know, takes off.
Yeah, so I'd just like to reinforce the Hahnemuhle one from there. When I first bought my printer, I got a couple of packs of the Hahnemuhle sample pack from there, the different varieties there, and some of that was exceptional from that point there. And I've just bought some more. Well, it was a few months back now, some more, but it's a really nice paper. Yeah,
that's
really
great.
good, so.
I mean, the thing is, if you go to, you know, there was definitely, and particularly, to be honest, from the camera club market, there was a lot of resistance to those matte materials at first, historically. I think that's largely changed, and a lot of people are exploring them now. But if you go to the sort of professional level, so if you go to the APA Awards or, you know, something like that, you will routinely now see, you know, 70% plus of prints on fine art materials. Like that, you know, people who really love imagery and who love the visual arts tend to gravitate towards them over time. It's just, I think, you know, there is that disconnect with that sort of classic photographic appearance initially, and there is that problem that they are a bit harder to print well with. So they take a little bit more effort and to be successful with. So, but they are worth it. You know, it's a rare person who, you know, we have a phrase around the office: once you go matte, you never go back. You know, it once you just kind of you kind of look at this image and you go, you know, I could print this on two things, but most of them are going to look better on matte, and that's not always fair. But you know, gloss and semi-gloss definitely do have their places. But a lot of things work on matte once you've mastered them, and they're hard not to love.
As you said, sorry, Ron, I'll come back to you in a second if that's okay. As you said, Jeremy, the matte papers are very fragile, and I must admit I've had a couple of disastrous experience with camera club competitions and matte prints because they often don't travel all that well.
That's absolutely true. Yep, it is definitely their Achilles heel. They are soft surfaced, and then you need to be careful with them. And there's no magic bullet solution for that, unfortunately. So, you know, that is, again, that takes you back to why so many people like that F-type gloss, because you have some of that matte joy, but you have a lot more robustness in that material. You know, you just don't have that delicate surface. Like a print like this one, you know, on matte black paper is you know, I can literally in front of your eyes, I can run my finger down it and leave a visible mark. It is so prone to marking. It's crazy. You know, there are some sprays that can help a little bit and that sort of thing, but by and large, and that's another great argument for white space. If you have this nice white border around your print, you're not going to find your fingers traveling right across the print. You know, it is inherently, it's going to be held to the edges. And I've seen people make books out of these prints, and as long as they have a decent amount of white space around the edges, you know, I've seen 15-year-old books that still look like the day they were printed, that have no marks on them at all. So, you know, I guess the white space is one of the tricks you can use there. But yes, you do have to be careful. And part of that is perhaps educating the people who are handling your prints at the camera club, you know, saying to those people who are, I'm sure, generously devoting their time to set all that up, just be aware they're fragile things and they need due care.
Yeah. I think Ron had a question, Jeremy. He's giving us a tour of his desk at the moment.
I'm hoping the microphone's working too, Russ. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Muffled.
That's right. It's through the beard at the moment. I'm just trying a new mic. So, Jeremy, this is just your 27-inch BenQ that you sold me about 6 months ago. So it's
very good. Okay.
Quite happily doing service down here at Owenbank.
Great. I'm glad to hear it.
Now, the question I had for you was, in terms of the availability of papers, it's interesting down here at Warragul. You know, you've got a very limited choice and size, and even in Melbourne, I've struggled. I haven't dropped onto the fact that there are some good specialist places I can go to. So
I mean,
the Michaels and the Teds and those.
Not Michaels anymore, but and Teds don't have a great fine art range. I would like to put my hand up here and say we have the widest range of fine art papers in the country, and we send them to people, including to Warragul, but all over the country, just all the time. And we do so very carefully, and we'd be happy to help you there. But anyway,
And so your stocks in North Melbourne, you generally tend to have a good range of.
We have a good range here, and anything that we don't have is usually only 2 to 3 days away. Particularly if it's Hahnemühle, there's as I say, there's now an excellent importer again, truly excellent. So if you're worried, like for example, if you're coming into Melbourne from a distance or whatever, give us a ring in advance, and we'll put it aside for you, ready to go, or put it through online. You can nominate pickup, and then we tell you when it's ready, and we do that literally every single day. So, and we keep all the popular stuff in stock here, so it's immediately available. Obscure sizes, or an unusual texture paper that only sells a few boxes a year, we get it into order. But if you're buying something like Hahnemühle bamboo or whatever, we have 27 boxes of A4 in stock today, type of thing. So it's no bother at all.
Okay.
Ron, we must have missed you, but occasionally there's a few of us get together, and when we're ordering inks, we just let other people know, and we have a bulk order which saves on the postage cost.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I cannot tell you though, I mean, this last year and a half, the amount of postage we have done is just bonkers. I mean, as in because of COVID, clearly. But I don't see it going back. I think a lot of people have got quite used to it now, and our online volumes have been, just ridiculous this past year. Crazy.
Mm-hmm. Other questions?
Okay, I've got one.
Gary.
Thanks for a good presentation, Jeremy.
No worries, Gary.
Could you just comment on, you mentioned earlier about getting an ICC profile created for your paper.
Mm-hmm.
Could you just comment on people who wish to create their own ICC profile?
As in actually created at home, or as opposed to having one created by a service?
That's right, as creating their own at home.
Yeah,
yes.
It's tricky because, look, you can do it. You absolutely can do it. There are, the entry level systems are currently running at about $700 or $800, so they're already not cheap, and they're reasonable systems. They'll calibrate both monitors and printers. That's the X-Rite i1 Studio, and it'll make pretty good printer profiles. I'm certainly considering its price; they're excellent, and it's a it
has one of those, Jeremy.
Oh yes, okay, yep. Yeah. How did you find it?
We bought it from you.
Yep. Unfortunately, I don't remember everything that everyone bought, but thank you for that. That's great. Look, I mean, it's the third version. They had the i1 photo and blah blah blah. Anyway, no, what was it? Color Monkey photo. Anyway, it's a good little device that makes pretty good printer photographs. I personally think you're better off using a service. And the next step up is getting quite expensive already. You're at about $3,000 or $4,000. For an i1 photo, an i1 published photo system, or whatever they're calling it. It's got an awful naming, but they're really quite good. But it's still a hand reader. The system we use is a very sophisticated automated reader. Cost us about 16 grand back in the day. It's very accurate, highly repeatable, so you can make the same profile. As in, if you measure the same thing twice, it comes out the same because there's no weirdness coming from the movement of your hand or anything. It's a marvelous system, and the profiles we make for it, they're only $50. So not really that expensive. It's obviously not as convenient as having your own solution at home. That's handy, particularly if you're the sort of person who likes testing a lot of papers. But I would argue that these days, by and large, the stock profiles available from, say, Hahnemühle or Ilford or whatever are, well, firstly, fairly comprehensive. They're available for most printers, notwithstanding that COVID has delayed making of profiles for the new Epson 906s, for example. But apart from that, in general, say you've got an Epson P800, profiles will definitely be available from Ilford, from Canson, from Hahnemühle, and so on, for you to use and test papers with. It's really when you commit to a paper and you start buying boxes of it and spending some money on it, that then you should consider a custom profile, because you will still, using a service like us, you will still get distinctly better results. Now, you will find for, say, 90, 95% of images that you print, the stock profile and the custom profile will actually produce a very visually similar result. There won't be a dramatic difference. But when you hit those really difficult images with lots of neutrals, for example, or those really deep shadows or really, really high highlights, the areas where specific printers do actually vary in measurable ways, then having a custom profile for your printer and that paper is just the most accurate way. And it is the way, it's the secret sauce behind all the fine art printing businesses. That is how we do it. That is how we still make prints that are, quite frankly, better than most people make at home. You know, those custom profiles are, you know, all the great printers use them, and they use them because they're the path to the best accuracy.
Thank you.
No worries.
Just on your profiles, Jeremy, when I purchased my printer, there was one of your custom profiles was included with it when I bought it. But
Yes,
I haven't utilised it.
No, look, and you're welcome to any time. It's actually 2, not 1. And there's no, well, I think realistically we have some piece of fine print on the website somewhere that says, you know, maximum of, I don't know, 3 years or something. But in reality, you know, we've never said no to someone. So yeah, take advantage of your free profiles. You're always welcome. You just go to the website, you follow the instructions that are on the website, and you produce something that looks very much like that. And you mail that in, or you bring that in. Usually within about 24 hours, you'll have the custom profile back in your email along with comprehensive instructions, and away you go. I tell you, it's the sort of thing that once you do it, you tend to do a lot more of it, as in once you realize how good they are and how much they can help you, and even how much, you know, sort of money they can save you in improved prints and therefore less ink and paper. We tend to find, you know, people then use them year by year, paper by paper for forever more. So
thanks for that.
That's okay.
Perhaps one more question.
Lucky last. Or have we run out? It sounds like we may have run out.
Yeah. Well, Jeremy, on behalf of the club, I'd like to thank you for your time tonight and your willingness to share with us.
You are very welcome. Thank you for having me.
And I guess we also appreciate ImageScience's ongoing support for the club with the National as well. So
again, you are welcome.
And I think you'll have at least one extra customer, judging by the reaction I've got from Ron already. So
yeah, that's good. I mean, you know, it's in the end, I do this stuff because I love printing. You know, that's fundamentally why I do it. And I always find it a pleasure to do stuff with the Warragul Club, because you are much more professional and organised than most of the camera clubs. So it, you know, just makes things easier and smoother and more pleasant, really. So that's great.
Stroking our ego is always good.
Yes, indeed. You know, well, you know, you scratch mine, I scratch your blah blah blah. You know, all that. But yes, no, good. Look, you know, I recognise almost all the faces, so you know, it is nice that that customers, clients, friends, whatever, are willing to listen to me. So that, you know, that's good.
Well, thank you, Jeremy.
Great talk.
Well beyond the hour that we talked about, but I think it's been
that's
very...
all right. You know, if you're going to sit down and do it, you might as well do it properly, I guess. Yeah.
Thanks, Jeremy. Well
Great.
done.
All right.
Yeah,
well,
thank you very much.
no worries.
Thank you.
Take care. See you next time.
Good night, everybody.
Bye. Good night.
Bye bye.